This is Vikes Now with Dustin Baker, the Wednesday edition, March 30th. We're going to talk about draft needs today for these 2022 Minnesota Vikings because the big wave of free agency is kaput. The pennies are tiny. If they want to sign more free agents, they're going to have to restructure with somebody like Eric Kendricks or Dalvin Cook. That is the only real places where the money could come from, barring some unforeseen trade. So, whether we like it or not, the team's going to have to use the draft to fortify some of its team needs. Thankfully, the Zadarius Smith signing, which fell out of the sky beautifully from Wisconsin, can alleviate a lot of the fears on the defense because if he's healthy, he and Hunter are going to be fabulous. Same for Hunter. If he's healthy, they're going to be fabulous. And that took a lot of anxiety away because otherwise, for a while we had maybe Hunter because remember he was on the trade block allegedly. And if he would have been jettisoned, you would have had DJ Wanham. And then what else are we doing here? Patrick Jones. But they flipped the script there. Indeed, we're going to have Hunter and Zadarius Smith. So it shows that they care about the 2022 defense for an offense-first regime. They're going to ensure that the enterprise is defense-heavy. Maybe not quite as Zimmer, quite like Zimmer, but who was as defense-heavy as Zimmer. So let's talk about the draft needs. Now, specifically, this pertains to the first round. I'll get into some of the stuff on the whole that can be fortified in the red meat of the draft in the third round, the fourth round. But these are the most, I'm ranking the Vikings' current roster needs based on the depth chart. So I'm going to start at the top. I think for suspense value, I should start at the bottom, but I know a lot of people tune in for the first few minutes and then click out because they got other stuff to do, which is cool. But foremost, no surprise, the Vikings need a cornerback. If indeed they said the hell with best player available, we're not doing that, that's not our team philosophy, then it's even more screaming that they need a cornerback. Because do not kid yourself. The way that they are situated right now on March 30th, the current group of cornerbacks is not going to cut it. Now, inside the NFC North, I guess there's two teams that you can get away with it. Against the Lions, who have the upstart, Amon-Ra St. Brown. He's pretty awesome. The Bears, Darnell Mooney and his pals, and then the Packers wide receiving core will be redefined over the next month, probably with the draft, unless they do that goofy shit where they just don't draft one. But on the whole, thankfully the NFC North receivers aren't as deadly as they were a month ago when Allen Robinson lived there and Devontae Adams lived there. And no major free agents went to the Detroit Lions wide receiving core. So we got a mulligan there. But that's not going to cut it outside the NFC North. And if the Vikings indeed want to be a playoff contender, they've got to have cornerbacks to stop some of these wide receiving cores. Tampa infamously has one that's brilliant, even though now it's Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, and whoever else they might get. They might have signed somebody. I can't remember. But they need a cornerback. In the first round at number 12, if they don't trade back, that would be Ahmad Sauce Gardner, if he falls there, or Derek Stingley, or a lot of folks like Trent McDuffie, Andrew Booth. McDuffie and Booth would probably be available if they traded back and somehow maybe went, like they did last year. I think they went back 9 spots to get Darisaw and got Kellen Mond and Wyatt Davis out of the deal, which may or may not be good. We don't know. But if they trade back, they could probably swing a second rounder, which would help. But I'm going to operate in the assumption that they'll stay put. Not on good. I don't have any tips on it. I just think that they probably will stay put at 12. And they foremost, the biggest need is cornerback. The only way that the current group would be successful in 2021 is if in year 3 Cameron Dantzler blossoms into a lockdown cornerback. Could it happen? Who knows? Hopefully, but that's not something that you bank on happening. It would be glorious if it did. He'd basically need to become Xavier Rhodes real quick, the prime version of Rhodes from, 2016, 2017. And then on top of that, let's assume that happens. Then Chandon Sullivan would have to morph into a CB2 who's pretty damn good, or Nate Hairston is suddenly a brilliant CB2. So that's 3 big hopes, dreams, wishes, ifs, and that ain't going to cut it. So they either have to re-sign Patrick Peterson, who's said like 5 times that he wants to play for the purple and gold team, but the value might not be congruent with how Kwesi Adofo-Mensah views the world. But he's there if you want him. If you can find the pennies, Patrick Peterson wants to come back. And then just like Zadarius alleviated anxiety on the defensive line, in theory, Peterson could do that with his all-pro pedigree. There is my cat trying to get in the screen. So they need a cornerback, and the way that they're trending right now, the roster need calls for it, and they're probably going to get one at number 12 in the draft. That is the top need. The secondarily need, because secondary gets confusing with that verbiage, is an edge rusher. Now, a month ago, that arguably was the top need because of the aforementioned Hunter rumors, the uneasiness about whether or not he was coming back. It appears that he is. They're working toward a long-term deal, and bada bing, we have Zadarius Smith now on the team. After that, though, it's kind of like the cornerbacks. They're maybes. DJ Wanham, there's a lot of theories about whether or not he's good or not. I think I told you guys I posted a stat about his sacks a couple months ago, and I was savaged by people telling me they were all situational and they were gift-wrapped for him, and I don't care. The guy got them. If it turns out he sucks, it'll come out in the wash. But I'm telling you, he got the sacks, and he deserves credit for that per the statistics. But they don't have edge rushers galore. And we've talked at length on this show about how they're banking on the fact Hunter and Zadarius will be healthy in their purest form and cause havoc. Beautiful, let's do it. But after that, what if they don't? What if Hunter has a third injury in 3 years that isn't ideal for anybody, or Zadarius' back injury is nasty? We'll be sitting here at this time next year thinking, God, we need an edge rusher. And then you're going to have to go spend money in free agency that we probably won't have. But they could get out in front of it now with the second roster need being an edge rusher. And that is Jermaine Johnson, who's from Eden Prairie, went to Florida State and Georgia for a little bit before that. Who are some of the other ones? The George K. I'm not going to screw up his name, the dude from Purdue. But there are edge rushers that will be attainable at 12 if the team wants to pluck them. That is the second biggest need because I want them to plan for the future with somebody young. Consider this. Most power rankings right now, whether you like those or you don't, consider the Buffalo Bills the best team in football as of late March heading into 2022. That team is poised and ready to break on through to the other side, like my favorite band, The Doors, said 50 years ago, to the Super Bowl because they keep getting nipped by the Chiefs. So here's the deal. Think about all the edge rushers that team has. Do you know who they are? I do. It's Von Miller, Gregory Rousseau, AJ Espinoza, Boogie Basham, and then on the inside of the line, Ed Oliver. That's 6 dudes that rush the passer. The Vikings got 2. And then developmental hopeful maybes and Patrick Jones, Janarius Robinson, Kenny Willekes, and Wanham, who's a little bit better than a hopeful maybe. The Bills have 6 pass rushers on the roster, and they're in it to win it. They want to get out of the AFC, which is suddenly just gangbusters for talent and quarterbacks, and every trade netted AFC bigger dividends. So, yeah, we need to emulate that in getting an edge rusher. So that's why I think it is the second most important need, and you shouldn't be disappointed if they draft Jermaine Johnson or one of those dudes in the first round, or if they can swing it in the second round, all the power to them. The next one, drum roll, not cool enough to have side effects yet on this show for that, would be quarterback. And this is preparing for life after Cousins. I talked about this a couple episodes ago, that if they don't do it in the first round, why not the second round? Inevitably, some of these quarterbacks who don't deserve to be first-round picks are going to be dragged into the first round by the thirst for securing a franchise quarterback, the media, the mock draft community, and then GMs. They just want to find their guy. So you're looking at the Commanders, the Lions, the Panthers, and Falcons that could conceivably draft a quarterback in round 1. And it leaves a couple of dudes on the outside looking in, whether they wait until the second round or they want to be the team to draft them at 12. But you can copy what the Chiefs did in 2017 when they had Alex Smith, who I don't think is quite as good as Cousins, but he was a winning quarterback that got the team into the playoffs most of the time, couldn't get them over the hump. Does that sound familiar to some of you? That sounds like the way that Kirk Cousins is portrayed by folks. And if there is nothing that's going to hurt if Malik Willis is there at 12, if Matt Corral is there at 12, for the Vikings to select him, because this roster can probably circumvent drafting outside of a roster need. I know it's not very deep. We still have the offseason left, training camp, preseason. They could still make trades. But if you want to copy what the Chiefs did, or in a unintentional way what the Patriots did 20 years ago with Bledsoe and Brady. You can have this asset in Cousins, who's handsomely paid. We get it. Makes a lot of money. Some of you don't like him. Some of you do. But you can have the best of both worlds. You can have a go at it with Cousins and O'Connell, assuming that his offensive brain and hopeful acumen to get a pass-protecting offensive line we talked about yesterday. Then O'Connell and Cousins can pair for gridiron marriage, and maybe this thing breaks through like Matthew Stafford did with the Rams. If it doesn't, if we're staring at another 8-9, 9-8, 7-10, 10-7 type of season that doesn't cut it, then you will have had Malik Willis or Matt Corral or one of those dudes ready when the Cousins decision won't be so... how can I say it? It won't be so like, God, what are we going to do next? Because that's one of the main beefs for the folks that wanted to get rid of Cousins this offseason is then what? You're just going to go get Bridgewater back. You're going to get Mariota. You're going to do the old Vikings thing where you go find this veteran dude who you think is good. And then what? Cousins is a lot better than those guys. But if you draft Malik Willis or Matt Corral, then in theory, that guy will have learned for a year. You're trading Cousins next offseason or the year after that, and then you have your starter. It's preordained that this quarterback would be the starter. And let's say Cousins lights it up next year. Good, best of both worlds. And you can turn around and evaluate him, trade him elsewhere, or trade this pick that you just had. Say Malik Willis' stock is pretty pristine. Well, flip him for a second or third rounder. But I do think you have a unique opportunity for a quarterback to consider it in rounds 1 or 2, and I make that the third biggest roster need. The next is what I talked about at the top of the show. It doesn't have to be in the first round, but interior offensive line. The center is Garrett Bradbury. He probably should have busted out by now per his first round draft stock, especially for a center. Centers shouldn't be drafted that high. Spielman did it. It was supposed to be a lock of the century that this center, the Vikings draft in the first round, would anchor the line for a decade. He has not anchored the line for a decade. He hasn't done anything close to it. Debatably, he anchors the run blocking, but he doesn't anchor the pass protection. So, somewhere, second round, third round, don't have a fourth rounder, they need to get an interior offensive lineman because the Jesse Davis solution is half measured, in my opinion. Now, yesterday after we recorded, Kevin O'Connell said that there's going to be an open competition at right guard. Fabulous. I think I prognosticated that on one of our first episodes, that that's what they should do this summer. Between Oli Udoh, Jesse Davis, and Wyatt Davis, find the best guy. But hey, let's throw another one in there where it doesn't even have to be a competition. If you drafted a guard or center in rounds 2, 3, or 5 that you like, then you can start them. That's where interior offensive linemen are usually scooped out of the draft in the middle, and then they start. We don't need to invest all this first-round draft capital. I see some fervor for the Tyler Linderbaum dude. Could you really be upset with an offensive line pick in the first round? Probably not, because you're one step closer to guaranteeing a fix for this problem that's lasted for 10 years. But I'm not going to pound the proverbial table for an offensive line because we've already seen that movie. I think they can fix this through the later rounds of the draft. Regardless, that is a roster need, and it should be vocally said out loud that the offensive line is not a finished project. It's just not. Unless the new offensive coaching staff does something that Mike Zimmer and his pals could not. Then they're in good shape, and only they know if they can do that. Next is everybody's favorite, is wide receiver. And it's not a glaring roster need because you have Justin Jefferson, who's had the best 2-year start to a career probably than anybody ever, with Cousins throwing him the ball. I've slide that in there because, the folks that don't think Cousins is any good, but magically the guy he throws it to is breaking records. It's mind-boggling. Thielen, who is going to be committed to the team at a handsome price for the next 3 seasons, and they're on the hook for that. His restructure indeed took consent from the player, like they have to be willing to restructure, but all that really does is wiggle money around, push it into the future. So they're banking a lot of money on Thielen being good into his mid-30s, which is another gamble, another risk, especially for Thielen, who hasn't had a 1,000-yard receiving season since 2018. It's a long time ago. Thankfully, he just scores touchdowns now. Since 2019, Thielen ranks 4th in the NFL in receiving touchdowns and 41st in receiving yards. It's one of the most vast divides between those two ranking metrics that you could find, especially in recent history. But they, in theory, need a wide receiver to prepare for life after Thielen. KJ Osborne took a mammoth leap last year for a wide receiver 3. It's up to you or the future to decide if he's a WR2. We are just so excited that we finally got a WR3 that, we're clapping and tweeting out the cool smirk that he had after he walked off on the Panthers, the snarl, I should say. But it is not conclusive on whether or not Osborne is a WR2. We know it can be a WR3, and then hopefully he explodes in an O'Connell offense that actually preaches WR3s. Remember how long under the Zimmer regime we had to pray that Laquan Treadwell broke out, or one of Tajay Sharp would turn into one? Osborne, under a anemic, offensive-minded Zimmer regime, was a WR3, and it worked. I should take that back about Zimmer and the offensive. He wasn't anemic, but in terms of his emphasis, it was glaringly evident that he cared more about defense. But preparing for life after Thielen and a contingency plan if Osborne is not a bona fide WR2, then this would be the time to draft a wide receiver, especially since you have an offense-first coach in the house. You could go get Garrett Wilson or Drake London, Jameis Williams. I'm trying to get all these draft names down. But 12 would be a spot. And here's the deal on that. Nobody's ever mad when a wide receiver is drafted in the first round. We're Vikings fans. We're used to good wide receivers finding their way to the organization, usually via draft. Justin Jefferson, Percy Harvin, and the King, Randy Moss. And then, of course, other guys like Chris Carter find their way to the organization and, by the way, have Hall of Fame careers. And one little known fact that when the Deshaun Watson trade hit, I was researching trades that big, and of course, Herschel Walker came up. Did you know that Jake Reed was one of the few fruits of the Herschel Walker trade that the Vikings received in return? They built the dynasty for the Cowboys, but, we got a consolation prize in Jake Reed, who was pretty good. So, wide receiver, that is important if you don't trust Thielen's short-term progression into his 30s. If you think that the injuries are going to nip him in the bud, then it's time to draft his replacement and prepare for the future. The good thing about wide receivers is that these days they have immediate impact. The last 2 years, dudes just set records, and one of them plays with purple clothes on, Justin Jefferson. Last year, the dude from the Bengals, Jamar Chase, upended the record. Jefferson only had it for 1 year. So wide receiver. And here's the final one, and this one is really interpretive, is safety. Not to replace Harrison Smith, because he should be good. The way that he's performed, he should be good for at least 2 or 3 more years. But if you don't trust Cameron Bynum, then you should probably draft a safety. I think they probably do. Bynum was a gamer, a playmaker in the chance that he got against the Ravens, one of those AFC teams in the middle of the season. So only they know right now, Ed Donatel and the gang, know if he's trustable as the safety complementary to Harrison Smith. If he is, then you don't really need one. Then Bynum will blossom, hopefully into a starter, maybe even a Pro Bowler. But that's all for them to decide. If they don't like him, then boom, you need a safety because they haven't signed one in free agency. Thankfully, for whatever they do, the history of the safety playing next to Harrison Smith is quite wonderful. Anthony Harris had a Pro Bowl season, almost Pro Bowl season that year that he led league interceptions. Andrew Sendejo always looked a lot better than he really was next to Hitman. Xavier Rhodes looked pretty good, and then we'll see what Bynum does. So safety is a need. And in conclusion here on the things on the draft, the best player available strategy is always going to net dividends. So I want to leave the group with the idea of Jordan Davis. It's kind of debatable whether or not at 12 he'd be the best player available. Based on the combine specs and footage, he would be remarkable inside of the Vikings defensive line. And you just can't pass on a guy that, if you have the sneaking suspicion in your gut as a general manager, is going to change the franchise and be a starter for a decade, it doesn't matter. It would almost be like at running back right now. I know they're not really drafted in the first round, but the Vikings have Dalvin Cook, Alexander Madison, and Kene Nwangwu. And they wouldn't draft a running back. However, if you had knowledge of forethought that Adrian Peterson was going to be there at 12, well, screw it. You take him because he's going to change everything that you do. So not advocating for a running back in round 1, but as an example, it doesn't matter how deep the depth chart is. If Kyle Hamilton, the safety, falls all the way to 12th in Minnesota, it's an absolute no-brainer that they would choose him, A, because he would be the best player available at the position, especially since mock drafts have him going in the top 5, and then boom, he fills the safety knee right next to Harrison Smith, and who better to learn next to than Harrison Smith in terms of perhaps Kyle Hamilton joining the franchise. So that's it. Don't forget about best player available, but in order, they need a cornerback, edge rusher, quarterback, interior offensive line somewhere in the draft, probably not in the first round, a wide receiver to prepare for life after Thielen, and a hedge against KJ Osborne, because we don't know if he'll mature into WR2 or not, and then a safety if they don't trust Cameron Bynum. That is the Wednesday edition of Vikes Now. I will be back tomorrow to chat about a different topic, and Skol, baby.